I'd like to make a few remarks. Before I do that, could we locate our Drucker Challenge discussant, which is Trang Nguyen, and get that person a microphone, and we'll take a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll take that question. I find these stories really inspiring, and I guess I'd like to make 3 points. The first is that if you think about what we're all coping with, wherever you are, wherever you work, we're actually dealing with two kinds of management systems, right? And the one is very traditional, and we've inherited it from the past, and it's one Julian referred to as well as Tim did, and that's the control system of hierarchy and rules and defined roles and specified jobs and all that, right? So we're still living with that. I mean, at least most of us are. And yet, with the advent of different ways of organizing, we're now also dealing with if you can think of the first type as vertical, you can think of this second type as horizontal. We're all dealing with massive networks of communication, of contact, of information flows, as Julian referred to. And neither has gone away. And so when I work with senior leaders, one of the biggest challenges I think we're facing is that we haven't done away with bureaucracy, we haven't done away with formal controls and roles and specified whatevers, and yet we're now taking on all this extra connectivity and horizontal communication. And a lot of that's essential. You heard Alexander yesterday talk about building bridges, but it's also hard to know what isn't, and we're swimming in a sea of communication and so forth. So I just would put that to you as a bit of a paradox. So I think that's one point I wanted to make based on our conversation. The second point is, I don't think those of us that talk about the practice of management talk enough about the dark sides. You know, there are people who cannot function in a world of ambiguity, and to whom the idea of having to come in every day and be creative is positively terrifying. And many of us kind of left it behind. And I was just thinking, I know so many leaders who are just stressed out. They're working on the weekends. They're on airplanes all the time. And I think there's some role here for using our collective intelligence to think a little bit about how we could do a better job of doing the balance, but also give some thought to the people who are left out of all this. You know, most of the people in this hall are going to be fine. You know, we're creative people with great educations, curious, you know, all the things we've talked about as wonderful qualities. But there are a lot of people who aren't, and I think we will pay the price of our neglect if we don't pay attention to that. And then I guess the last thing I'd like to comment on is the notion of psychological safety and the notion of zigzag careers. So Google did a fascinating study 2 years ago in which they found that the highest performing teams were those in which they could effectively communicate openly with each other. They could share bad news, they could give tough feedback, they could do so, but in an atmosphere of psychological safety. And on top of that is another study that was done by Korn Ferry, the very famous executive search firm. And what they found was, when they looked at data from LinkedIn, that if you look over the past 5 years or so, and you look at CEO level appointments, that those people do not have linear careers. They have careers that zig and zag. If they were in operations, they took a turn in marketing. If they were in marketing, they took a turn in supply chain. And so our very notions of what constitutes a successful career are really changing, because a lot of times it's a lateral move that opens the door to new opportunities and that changes the way that you think about things. So with those 3 thoughts before us, let's take our question from our Drucker Challenge person, if we've found that person. Have we found that person?
What was the name again?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's Trang Nguyen? Is that you? You think so?
Well,
I apologize for my horrible pronunciation
Might
of this name.
criticism.
Well, you know, you could always be really entrepreneurial and rise to the occasion, because nobody will tell you any different.
That's me. I'm Brian.
Okay, my name is Trang Nguyen.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
I'll know it for next time.
Okay, so I have a question for Professor Julian, but well, comments from other panelists would be very appreciated. So I am a PhD student in chemistry, so probably very different from most people here. And my question for you is, So for science and technology focused organizations, say a biotech company, for example, and so you talk about like data and big data. And I think for these organizations and for us in science in general, data is very important. I actually do not think that data belong in hell. So what do you think for these organizations, like the role of the left side, as you called it, like info and knowledge, versus the right side, action and the emotional conviction for us, like advice from me and people like me in general?
This is the personal counseling portion of this
Exactly.
panel.
Well, so, I mean, hopefully my original point was clear that I don't want to do away with all this stuff. And I do get into trouble here. I remember when I first presented my ideas on this, there were some people from IBM in the audience. And IBM, as an organization, has completely set its future on Smarter Planet. In other words, on using analytics and data and so forth to help organizations. So clearly that is all important stuff. And in some industries, the scientific answer, if you like, is 999 thousandths of the way there. In other industries, it only gets us 8/10 of the way there. And so my point is that even in the most scientific of disciplines, we still need to ensure that we've understood the context and the reason why we're asking that question in the first place, if you see what I mean. In some ways, this whole argument has become easier since, for a British person, since the Brexit decision in June, because, there was a very famous politician, Michael Gove. He said, we've had enough of experts in this country, basically. We don't need experts to tell us what to do. What we need, essentially, he was saying, are people who are good at persuading people through emotion and intuition and leadership. Now, obviously, I don't agree with where Britain ended up in that decision. I think perhaps the Leave side should have spent a bit more time playing to the emotional and intuitive beliefs and concerns and fears of people, rather than just going down to more and more hard data from the OECD and the IMF as a way of justifying an argument. So hopefully you can see my point that we need a balance, as always, and in some areas we need more emphasis on an emotion, conviction, and decisive action. In other areas, perhaps a little bit less.
I'd love to bring Tim in on this, in the notion of how do you get to this very human-centered connection?
I was going to actually start off with a quote from one of my favorite scientists, actually, E.O. Wilson, who's the great ecologist, who described scientists as being both poets and bookkeepers. And what he meant by that was that data and diligence about data and understanding what the data are telling you is an essential part of science. But so are the leaps of imagination that allow the most important hypotheses often to be constructed, right? Because hypotheses are often very complex, synthetic ideas in the best of science, and that relies to some degree on intuition as well as on data. So I just want to start off with that because I thought it was an elegant. It was
nice transition.
It was an elegant definition, but I think that the best creative people that I know, the best designers I know, the best innovators I know are obsessed with evidence, right? They're obsessed with trying out their ideas in order to gain evidence, and so Julian showed the relationship between these two things, that your intuition gets better and better informed by the evidence that you gain from experimentation or trying things out with customers or however you want, or testing a story out in the world and see what comes back at you. I mean, whichever approach you take, that we rely on evidence in order to make progress. And so again, these are combinatorial ideas. I think it is not about saying that data isn't useful. The issue I think that we do have, and I think that Julian described very elegantly, is that it's very easy to get ourselves into a position where we think the right question is the right question simply because of what the data is telling us, right? And that leads us. I mean, a quick story, but one of the large retailing organizations that we might have already discussed this morning, but I'm not going to specify, found itself wondering why certain products were not being bought by their customers. Their POS system was saying consistently that certain products were not being bought by their customers, and so they decided that they wouldn't stock them anymore. At the same time, they'd done a very sensible thing, and they'd had some researchers doing kind of customer follow-alongs, following customers into the store to get qualitative information about the customers. And what they found is the customers couldn't find that product on the shelf because they were out of stock, so they weren't buying them because they couldn't find it. They did actually go into the store wanting to buy the product. So, of course, the data that the POS system was telling was saying people don't want this product. In fact, the real data, which is what were customers doing, was indicating just the opposite. So we have to be a little careful about sometimes
Absolutely.
what the data tells.
I have a friend who's a CEO of a retailer, and he says to me, it's a terrible situation to be in, because a customer comes into my shop wanting to buy 10 things, they buy 4, and I think I've had a great day. Which just kind of backs it up. We have a question from the Slido for Rosebery, actually, which is, could you comment on why, given that Tony Hsieh's decision to reorganize Zappos into a holacracy made so many of his employees unhappy, why he would do that anyway?
Why did he do that? I think it's really kind of building on some things we heard yesterday. I think he believed that bureaucracy was starting to kind of creep into the organization, that managers were creating a political environment so people didn't feel like they could kind of move forward in a way that I think he felt he was turning into a big old organization. I think he felt he was moving away from being an explorer organization into a more administrative one.
Interesting.
Although, ironically, what I hear about holacracy is it created a huge amount of bureaucracy in and of itself.
It did in of itself, yeah. The
but,
jury's
you know,
definitely out.
yeah.
Well, it's interesting because in Tony Hsieh's history, this is not his first company. He'd started a couple of others. And I had the opportunity to meet with him on a number of occasions. And his first company became very successful, but eventually he hated going to work there because he felt while he'd worked on the business, he hadn't worked on the culture.
Yeah.
So, Sarah, perhaps this is a good opportunity for you to jump in and comment on how do you see space and culture interacting?
Mm-hmm. I think space and culture are really intrinsically linked. And if you think about examples in everyday life, we can think of lots of kinds of spaces, like libraries are a great example, where the space intuitively gives us a sense of permission to behave in certain ways and to speak at a certain volume and do certain activities. And it strongly also tells us that lots of behaviors are not permitted in that space. So I do think that as human beings, we always exist in place, and those places give us quite a bit of direction about what's permitted, what's allowed, what's valued. So I think it's really important to ask that same question of your own space and to say, does my space, if someone were to walk into this space, does it actually reflect the culture and the things that I value? If I want my employees to experiment, if I want them to build things and make things, are there places for them to do that? Is there physical stuff? Are there tools that are easily accessible? If I value connection and collaboration, are doors open? Are people out in the open? Do people actually go to a cafe or a cafeteria to sit and have a coffee or eat lunch together? Is there a place for them to actually collaborate? So I think they're intrinsically linked, and it's really important to ask yourself, does the culture that I believe I have and that I want to promote, does my space actually send consistent signals?
Nice, very nice. So there was another question from the floor, and I'd love some joint reflections on this, but, can leadership under ambiguity be taught, and can managers be trained to be more empathetic if they've grown up in a kind of a command and control system? And I think that actually there are some fantastic examples of organizations that are simultaneously very empathic, but also very command and control. And most of the world's great militaries and their academies have a very finely honed way of balancing those two. Because you're literally putting your life on the line for the people who are part of your organization. And most of us in business don't have that steep a level of challenge. So they've really thought about it. So yeah, I do believe it can be taught at a more kind of what do you do about it very practically kind of line, and perhaps you can comment on this, Julian. There are some very simple rules that you can begin to implement that begin to change the nature of the conversation in your organization. So I'll take 2 examples. One is a no interruption rule. And this comes from a film producer who happened to have, in this case it was women, but it could as easily have been any low power minority, as part of his pitch meetings for his programs. And what he noticed was the women weren't contributing. And he went to them and he said, why don't you speak up more? You know, I'm paying you a salary, do your job, right? And they said, well, you just watch what happens when we do. And so they began to contribute. And of course, they got interrupted. And then the same thing that happens to a lot of folks who are in low power situations is 3 minutes later, someone in a high power position says, oh, I had this idea, and everybody says, whoa, received wisdom, when the same idea had been in the conversation 3 minutes before. And so he instituted a couple of very simple social engineering kind of practices. One was a no interruption rule. Everybody had to be heard before the conversation could resume. And you know, he documented ideas. There was another rule that he put in place where people would advocate for each other's ideas. There was a rule about that. So you can start to do very simple kinds of social engineering around how you just conduct ordinary meetings. And what they found, incidentally, was the quality of the ideas for the whole team improved. And the reason they knew that is because they make actual money when the quality of their ideas is better. So that was a real evidence. A couple of other just comments on who's in the room, who has conversations in the room. Diverse teams have been empirically shown to perform better, but feel worse, which I think is fascinating. Apparently being with somebody who's different from you activates this part of your brain that creates much more openness to new ideas, willingness to reconsider taken for granted assumptions, all the things we say we want, but it's a lot more work. And so when the process is done, people feel exhausted and irritated. And why was that such a difficult conversation? So I think that's a paradox that's very interesting for us to try to navigate.
One observation to the question, can managers who lack empathy or confidence to manage under uncertainty be trained and successfully apply it? I mean, up to a point, yes. I think any of us can get better at doing certain things. But I want to make one very specific observation, which is as we see organizations attempting to move towards some of these more organic, or in my terms, ad hocratic ways of working, what we're doing clearly is we're trying to liberate people on the front lines. And for that to work, the line managers who are doing the liberating have to completely buy into this new way of working. And I can think of a couple of very specific examples, Microsoft being one, where I saw some very interesting experiments going on in parts of Microsoft with some very enlightened managers. But because those individuals' bosses didn't kind of get the experiment kind of stopped there. And for me, the important point to take away is, as we're thinking about trying to make wholesale changes, it only takes a few, shall we say, old school thinkers within such a process to derail the efforts of a large number of more enlightened people. Because there's nothing worse than when your boss says to you, what's happening in that project? You say, I don't know, I'm trusting my people to get on with it. That's not a good answer, right? The boss has to understand that you're trusting those people and that you do not know every detail of what's happening there. So we've got to find a way of ensuring that the people who don't get this more empathetic approach actually move into jobs that they're more suited to do.
Yeah, and I think that's an important consideration too, because not all of us live in, playpens with Post-it notes and cool stuff, right? Some of us actually have to go in and run factories and that kind of thing. Right. And the other thing I think that is influential here is the notion of where in your competitive life cycle are you? So you guys would come in right at the beginning, right? Then there's a whole bunch of people doing the operating, and then there's the end. You've got to exit, get out, make tough decisions, close plants, whatever it is. And I think different leaders sort of are more suited for those different stages.
A couple of things I might just add to that is, I think we have to be a little thoughtful about what kinds of ambiguity we're talking about. Right. And it's not abstract ambiguity that, at least I'm thinking about. It's the willingness to embark on a process, a project, a journey without having to know the answer before you start. It's that kind of ambiguity, right? So it's being action-oriented, as Julian was talking about, is actually the solution to dealing with that ambiguity. It's get on with something. And rather than trying to figure out all of the ambiguity and solve for it before you start anything. So I think that's important. The other thing is that we're seeing in organizations today that so many of the things that did used to have a beginning, a middle, and an end don't actually have the middle and end anymore, right? Because because the kinds of ways in which we're delivering value in the market through software, through services, never get they never get completed, right? They're constantly evolving and constantly being innovated on and constantly being designed. So we actually need, and this is true not just in the products and services that we ship to our customers, it's true in the way we think about what goes on in our talent organizations or in our marketing organizations. And so there's this need for this sort of iterative approach, this ad-hocratic
Always in
approach
beta.
in
Always in
almost
beta.
every part of the organization. So that tension that you talked about, Rita, gets almost more extreme.
It does.
Because we see it everywhere.
I want to jump in on this too and just build on this point that you were both making about action orientation. I think this is a great example of where physical space can really reinforce the right behaviors and the right culture, because if you're that leader that decides I'm going to wrestle through ambiguity by acting and by doing things, if you're doing that behind a closed door that no one can see, I mean, visibility into that process, it sends such a strong and powerful message to your organization to say, wow, like I see these people in there, even if it's glass, like I can't hear what they're doing, but just knowing that work is happening around you. It's like in a complex adaptive system, for an actor to have an understanding of the context of what's happening in that system is hugely important. So I think it's not just about taking action, but thinking about how are you making it visible to others that this is an organization where leaders take action, where people take action, where we work through ambiguity. That just ripples throughout an organization.
And I think the bigger lesson there is to be thoughtful about it. You know, what is the primary task these people are facing, and construct an environment that makes sense given that task. One thing I think that has come across in the conversation very clearly is the importance of influence, that leaders today in many cases need to influence more than direct. And I think it's useful to reflect on the work of Robert Cialdini. Some of you may know him. He wrote a very interesting book called, I think, Persuasion. And he talks about some very simple principles that you can start to use if you wish to persuade others to do something which they would not do absent your persuasion. And I think stories are a big part of this. So the first principle is liking. We tend to respond to people that we think like us. So liking, creating an empathic connection. Another one is social proof. We tend to do things that we think others like us do. And that applies for good. So if we see somebody doing something worthy and honorable, we tend to mimic. If we see somebody doing something sort of not so great, we tend to mimic. So it's a very powerful influence on people. Authority, of course, both informal and formal authority. Commitment. We tend to conform our behavior to what we believe are the commitments that we've made previously. And scarcity. Buy one now. Go on those websites, right, and they say only 2 left in stock. Better buy it now. A lot of that's manufactured. It is made up to fool us into performing the way that they want us to perform. So, for good or for ill, that's how human beings often respond to influence. We've got about 10 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is just ask each of our panelists to sort of talk about, for a minute or so, about what would be something you'd like to leave the audience with, and then we'll take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So maybe, Rosemary, start with you.
Shall I start? So I guess I think what I'd like to leave the audience with is this notion of story not being a soft thing that's nice to have, but absolute necessity in organizing companies in the kind of the complex world that we live in. It is the thing that helps simplify, and we talked a lot about that, and kind of bring focus and bring energy. And so I think you have to ask yourself, what is your story and what is the higher purpose? Really critically, how are you asking people or creating the platform for people in your organization to join and share that story and act on it and bring it into their everyday activities? Story is not something you tell once. It's a constant, you're constantly iterating and growing and bringing it out there. So how are you bringing them in? And then how are you bringing the outside in? Because I don't think, for me, and we didn't get to talk about this much, I didn't hear much about this yesterday, I don't think the organization, the kind of companies that we talk about today are going to be really the organizations that we think about tomorrow. What is a company? Is it just the people who work there? Is it the people who you partner with? Is it your customers? More and more of those people are part of your company and influence well. So how do you bring them and engage them? And I think story is a very helpful way to do that.
Thank you. Great. Julie.
So look, I've already set out my stall in terms of adhocracy or an action orientation. The additional point I'll make, and this refers to some of the questions we've been getting through Slido, is people have asked, what about Frederick Laloux's concept of the teal organization? What about holacracy? How does what I'm talking about fit with the concept of agile? I've talked about action orientation as an organizational imperative. In some ways, what we're seeing right now is a lot of organizational experiments under these various different headings, which are all about helping to create these new management practices. And of course, the point is that that holacracy may or may not be the right solution, but it is a very conscious attempt to shift away from classic bureaucratic methods to more autocratic methods. And undoubtedly, coming out of all of these experiments, we will see some better ways of working. And of course, those are the things that I think we need to embrace.
That's very optimistic.
It
How
is.
delightful. Sarah?
I guess I'd just reinforce one of the points that I made in my comments, which is to really encourage you to think about the message that your space is sending about you as a leader. Because it is sending a message to your organization, whether it's an intentional message or not. So when you go home from this conference, the next time you're in your office, stop and take a look around and reflect on what it's communicating, what it's sending to others about the culture, about your leadership, how is it enabling you, and just ask yourself those questions because they're important.
Great.
Yeah, I guess I'd build out on that and say that we're, as Julian elegantly described, we're at a moment when the context and environment for business and for organization and therefore for management is changing. It happens to be true for almost all of the systems that we've relied on for the last 100 or 150 years, not just management and business, but our organizations, but our education system, our systems of taxation, our systems of government are all at some level up for question as we move beyond the age of information. And it seems like to me, the most valuable tool that we each have as leaders is at the very least to question our assumptions. It may or may not lead you to choosing new experiments or choosing new solutions or new options that are out there. But if we don't question our assumptions, then we're going to blindly follow the systems and tools that we already have, which are shown to be ever less fit for purpose. So just question assumptions.
Question the assumptions. And we know people are terrible at doing that. We have enough time for perhaps 2 questions from the floor. There's someone here in a gorgeous tie. You got the color message today. Excellent.
Oh, the lady behind.
Oh, lady behind? All right, we'll come back to you in a minute then. Go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm very excited about these ideas, but let me mention a practical problem. Based on research studies, in Eastern Europe, the typical way of managing is top-down, bureaucratic, including the practices of the mentioned company, legal. So as consultants, how could you convince managers in another part of Europe that it makes sense to encourage employees to be involved, to be creative, and it makes sense for the company. It helps companies make better, more profit. So what would you do if you were invited to this part of the world to do the
Do you want to
job
take that
as
one? And then, Tim,
consultants?
perhaps you
Thanks.
A quick observation from me. First of all, let's be very clear that my remarks, and indeed every person on this panel, this is a very Anglo-American panel, we are all rooted in our own assumptions and cultural assumptions, organizational assumptions. The model I describe of autocracy is individualistic, right? And it works very well in certain cultures and very poorly in others. So, when I go to Eastern Europe, when I go to Asia, I attempt to be a little bit more culturally astute than to simply say, it's all about action orientation, because, every culture has its own norms about what is an appropriate set of behaviors. Now, I don't want to completely lose this notion of action orientation. I believe that we can absolutely reframe it in a way that makes it a little bit, shall we say, more, culturally thoughtful, but without losing the essence of it. Now, we don't have time to discuss the specifics of it now, but I think we have to go in challenging our assumptions, understanding our assumptions about where our models are coming from.
Great.
Just quick a couple of things. First, I would say that there's a take on perhaps on adhocracy which looks at collectivism a little bit, and because collective action is not so different,
That's
right?
right, that's true.
And that can be perhaps feel more attuned in certain parts of the world. One observation I would make is that something that's rather astounded me over the last year or two at IDEO is the number of legal organizations within companies that are reaching out to us to ask how they can behave differently. to the point where our general counsel, who's a tremendously creative person, is now leading a team consulting to the legal industry on how to behave differently. So, pigs occasionally fly, it's amazing. So,
That's great. So if we could have the mic up here and one short last, oh, you got it. Okay, one short last question.
Yeah, good morning. It is question to Sarah. I am really confused, being academic, private entrepreneur, how office can be a powerful tool for positive leadership. Can you explain to us what is the top level, middle level, or lower level? And what percentage of success you have any record or any example?
I'm sorry, you mean what?
I'm really confused about your comment.
Okay.
Office is one of the powerful tools
Yeah,
of positive leadership.
yes.
My question is, what level of leader? It is a top level,
Yeah,
middle level,
sure.
or bottom level?
Well, I would say more broadly, I was focusing on leadership given the context of this particular panel, but I really think space is a powerful tool for all employees at any level of an organization, but the problems that it can solve or the opportunities it can unlock are different. So I think when you think about top leadership, CEOs thinking about how space might enable them to lead their organizations in the ways that we've been talking about on this panel. But equally important is mid-level management as well as lower-level employees, and thinking about the kinds of behaviors and the kinds of outcomes that we want to generate at each of those levels, and then asking the question, how can those spaces support those? So I do think that space is important, not just for the top-level leaders, but for all individuals throughout the organization, just in different ways.
Thank you. So I'm going to wrap up because we really are almost out of time. Please feel free to grab any of our panel. I'm sure they'd be happy to interact with you. I'd like to close this panel, which has sort of been based on the assumption that things are changing, that things are really different. And I'd like to talk for just a second about what hasn't changed. And what hasn't changed, I believe, is the symbolic impact of leadership. If you think of a management symbol, it's something that has meaning beyond its inherent substance. And as a leader, every single thing you do, where you sit, how you move, what you wear, who you talk to, everything has meaning beyond its inherent substance, and that hasn't changed. So I would really encourage everybody here to think about the symbolic meaning that you're creating in those that you interact with, because I think that hasn't changed, and it's a hugely important lever for getting organizations to operate even under conditions of high ambiguity. So thank you, panel, and we're ready for our next session.